Hello. So in this video I'm going to talk to you about Sigmund Freud's Civilization and Its Discontents, which in my opinion is one of the most significant works of cultural theory ever, maybe. Certainly at the very least of the last 120 some years. So Civilization and Its Discontents distills down a lot of Freud's cultural arguments that he develops over the course of a number of books and articles and things like this. So it's not a book about psychoanalytic practice as such. It's a book about the psychoanalytic perspective on culture and on the nature of civilization. And essentially, Freud's thesis is that modern people, modern men as Freud would put it, but modern people are largely discontented, are largely anxious, neurotic, depressed, etc., because of the fundamental strictures of culture, the cultures that we live in. So not culture in the sense of like opera and things like that, but culture in the sense of social norms and restrictions on behavior, the alienation of industrial or post-industrial labor practices, and so on and so on. So we get this very directly here. Freud says, when we start considering this possibility, that's the possibility that something insurmountable fundamentally underlies contemporary anxieties, something natural, Freud might say. When we start considering this possibility, we come upon a contention which is so astonishing that we must dwell upon it. This contention holds that what we call our civilization is largely responsible for our misery, and that we should be much happier if we gave it up and returned to primitive conditions. I call this contention astonishing because, in whatever way we may define the concept of civilization, it is a certain fact that all the things with which we seek to protect ourselves against the threats that emanate from the sources of suffering are part of that very civilization. In other words, what he's saying here is that the fundamental idea behind civilization is to make our lives more comfortable, safer, happier, easier, etc., and yet the way that civilization actually functions is in fact to deprive us of some sort of inner peace, some sort of existential equilibrium, I suppose. And this is the idea Freud introduces the book with. This is the idea that he starts Civilization and Its Discontents with. And he discusses it particularly in the guise of religion and what he calls an oceanic feeling. So what he says, when thinking about and Freud has a very distinct perspective on religion that I'm not going to cover that much, but largely he thinks that religion is a sort of coping mechanism, or at least in this book. In some of his other books, like Moses and Monotheism and Totem and Taboo and Future of an Illusion, all of which he discusses religion, and he has slightly different points that he makes. But at least here, religion is meant as a sort of psychological safety blanket, if you will. It is a structure, a cultural practice that allows us to get back to what he discusses as a sort of pre-conscious state. So he says here, in this way then the and this is talking about the sort of early, at least the way that Freud thought of sort of early moments of the human psyche, of human psychology. He says, in this way, then, the ego detaches itself from the external world. Or to put it more correctly, originally the ego includes everything. Later it separates off an external world from itself. Our present ego feeling is, therefore, only a shrunken residue of a much more inclusive, indeed an all-embracing, feeling which corresponded to a more intimate bond between the ego and the world about it. So this is, for Freud, this is the world of the womb, basically, where the existence of the universe is entirely conceptualized as our own existence. Like, we are inherently linked to it. Lacan will later sort of develop this break more in his theory of the mirror stage, this sort of the moment in which a child recognizes that there is a distinct gap between the self and the non-self, the self and everything else in the universe, which is external. But this is essentially what Freud is talking about here, is that this is the original psychological condition out of which human beings are born. And as we become increasingly aware of the distinction between the self and the external, this is a sort of traumatic separation. This is a loss of that universal feeling. And so, actually, this is part of this is associated with what Freud calls the death drive, or the death instinct, as it's sometimes translated. Contrary to what might, or slightly contrary to what might seem very obvious to speakers of English about the name of this instinct, this is not actually a wish to die necessarily. This is a wish to return to a non-organic state of oneness with the universe, or oneness with existence. And Freud, actually, in other books, like Beyond the Pleasure Principle, argues that that's the central psychological motive for most human action. The death drive, in principle, coexists alongside the pleasure principle. And the pleasure principle is essentially the impulse to enjoy, the impulse to gratify the instincts, the impulse to eat what we want, to have sex when we want, to sleep when we want, to commit violence when we want, etc., etc. The pleasure principle for Freud is tamped down by what he calls the reality principle. And the reality principle is essentially the sort of recognition that we can't go through life giving in continually to the pleasure principle. We can't just do whatever we want whenever we want, for a variety of reasons. Physical danger, if you want to experience the rush of jumping off a cliff, it's quite dangerous to do that. And so the reality principle is what comes along and says, let's pump the brakes. The reality principle becomes increasingly significant as you move from sort of primitive hunter-gatherer societies to more complex cultures, according to Freud. And again, there's some sort of problematic early 20th century anthropology and stuff going on with this argument, but essentially what he argues is that as civilizations become more regimented, as they place increasing demands upon the subject becomes increasingly anxious, neurotic, depressed, alienated, etc., etc. And so this is the central contention of the book, is that advanced industrial or now post-industrial civilizations put demands on the subject which makes us anxious and unhappy.